Hi there, I'm Natasha Zouves. I spoke with Professor Avi Loeb about UAPs. He has a message for Elon Musk, and he has a piece of advice for everyone. He says if you ever meet an alien, never shake its hand. Here's our conversation. Professor Avi Loeb, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
It's my great pleasure to join you, Natasha.
Let's talk about your research and let's talk about UAPs and UFOs as well. I've always wanted to ask you, what is the most compelling piece of scientific evidence so far in your mind that UAPs and extraterrestrial life may actually exist?
Yeah, so I should say, I grew up on a farm and I wasn't necessarily planning to become a scientist. I was interested in philosophy and the big questions. And then circumstances brought me to science. And so I mentioned that because the way I think is following common sense. I'm not swayed by sophistication. I don't need very sophisticated mathematics to feel good about myself. And the reason I say that is because right now, theoretical physics is driven by people who work on the question of what might reality be like if it had extra dimensions. And they've been doing it for decades. We have no evidence for extra dimensions. I don't want to speculate about that. But at the same time, the possible existence of something like us is being considered as an extraordinary claim. And I say that makes no sense whatsoever. Because right now we know that there are hundreds of billions of stars within the Milky Way galaxy, like the sun, and at least a few percent of them, tens of billions of stars, have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. And so I say, well, you have all these other systems that look just like our home, okay? At least superficially, based on what we know. So it's just looking through the window of your house and seeing a lot of houses down the street. Now, my colleagues are arguing it's an extraordinary claim to imagine that they have residents like ourselves. We are the pinnacle of creation. And Elon Musk himself says we need to go to Mars because we have responsibility to save ourselves because maybe, most likely, we are alone. And I say, no, that is the least likely possibility. The most likely possibility, there were other civilizations like us billions of years ago because most stars formed before the sun, billions of years before the sun. And it's only natural to say we exist, therefore there should be things like us around those stars, and they existed before us. And so all I'm saying is, let's look for evidence. So after the elections, Peter Thiel talked in various podcasts, and he said, the conclusion of this election is never bet against Elon Musk. So the following day, I placed a bet against Elon Musk in an essay that I posted on medium.com. And I said, I'm willing to put 1% of my net worth against 1% of his net worth in a pool of money that will be used to look for the evidence, okay? And it would be of order $4 billion, the 1% of his net worth. Mine is completely negligible. But it's not a lot of money because we are planning right now, the mainstream of the astronomy community is planning the Habitable World Observatory. That's a telescope that is supposed to be built in the 2040s, will cost more than $10 billion, and will look for microbes through the molecules that may exist in the atmospheres of other planets, molecules like oxygen or methane or CO2 or water that would indicate perhaps that these planets host primitive life, microbes. And I say, let's hedge our bets because it might be easier to detect intelligent civilizations. And we are probably in the middle of our class. And so we should just look. Now, in the past, we were looking for radio signals, but that's just like waiting for a phone call at home. Nobody may call you. And,
nobody may call you. And can I ask, what do you make of the galactic zoo theory that there is other extraterrestrial life, intelligent extraterrestrial life? They know about us and they're avoiding us.
Well, it's possible. So, all of these arguments resemble what single people often say. I don't have a partner right now. Perhaps we are alone. I will be alone. And Enrico Fermi said, where is everybody? And, when you see a lonely person asking this question, you say, don't be so presumptuous. You don't expect the partner to come and sit next to you because you are not that attractive, frankly, and you need to go out of your house and search for others in dating sites, or perhaps at the very least, look through the windows.
But Avi, are we looking for trouble? I mean, what is to say if something is out there that is probably way more intelligent and advanced than we are? Why would we think they would treat us any better than we treat other species we feel superior to on this own planet?
For a simple reason. Again, I show my optimism. I think we don't care we don't account for much. They don't care about us. Okay, so we tend to think that we are really important. So we thought that we are at the center of the universe, just like my daughters were when they were infants. By the way, you should think about the human brain, just like AI systems. When my daughters were young, they were in the crib. Okay, and so their training set, the training data set that they absorbed, their brain absorbed, was just limited to the environment of the crib. Then they started to crawl and walk around the house, and their training data set grew to be the entire house. But when they would see something from the windows, if they saw another house, they would argue that it's very likely that there is no infant that deserves as much attention as they do. They thought that they're at the center of the universe, very similar to my colleagues in astrobiology.
You think we're cosmic toddlers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We haven't matured. But when I took them on the first day in the kindergarten, they had a psychological shock. And, I think it's really important for us to have this shock therapy, because right now we are obsessed with conflicts on this rock that we were born on. And what can take us out? Well, of course, the hippies back in the 60s, would sing John Lennon's song, Imagine All the People Living in Peace. I'm not that naive. I don't think that by, a group of people advocating for peace, they would convince politicians to reach some peaceful state. I think it's much more likely that we would realize that someone else is doing better than us. Another civilization is far more advanced. We can learn from them. It will inspire us. Now, this is not my idea. If you look at the religions in the past, they talked about the Messiah coming to earth. And they said the Messiah will bring peace. In my mind, the Messiah will come from another star. The messenger might be actually a technological gadget. And if I find it, at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, the only question that I will have is whether to press a button on it.
I want to ask you about Oumuamua. You believe that it could have extraterrestrial origins. Tell me more why.
Yeah, so this was the first object reported to have come from outside the solar system. And the way to tell that is by the speed of the object relative to the sun. It was moving faster than the escape speed from the sun's gravity. So it was clearly not bound to the sun like the planets are. And so it was discovered by accident because it passed near Earth. And the telescope that discovered it in Hawaii was looking for near-Earth objects to protect us from killer asteroids. And this object showed up, and they measured its speed, and it appeared to be the first interstellar object. And it was roughly the size of a football field, 100 meters in size. And so they said, oh, great, we found a rock that came from outside the solar system. But then the question was, is it an asteroid or is it a comet? A comet is an icy rock that is, the ice is evaporated when the object comes close to the sun, so we see a beautiful cometary tail. But there was no cometary tail around Oumuamua, and as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. And that meant that the object has a very extreme shape. The most likely fit to the variation of light was that of a pancake, a disc-like object, which is very strange. We've never seen an object that changes its brightness so much by reflecting sunlight. And then there was a non-gravitational acceleration, something pushing it away from the sun without it evaporating. We haven't seen any trace of evaporation, so I suggested it's just the reflection of sunlight. And the name Oumuamua means a scout, an object that came from far away. And then 3 years later, the same telescope in Hawaii discovered another object that was pushed by reflecting sunlight. And it ended up being a rocket booster from a 1966 launch by NASA. So here you have a demonstration of what I argued for, that a technological object with a thin wall can be pushed by reflecting sunlight. And my colleagues argue that Oumuamua is either an iceberg made of hydrogen, of nitrogen, or perhaps even a dust bunny. And all of these suggestions have difficulties because a hydrogen iceberg would get evaporated very quickly, would not survive the journey. There is not enough solid nitrogen to account for such an object. The idea was if it evaporates, nitrogen is transparent, hydrogen is transparent, you wouldn't see the cometary tail. And then there was the suggestion maybe it's a dust bunny, but 100 times less dense than air. But such an object would get disrupted. It would not maintain its integrity when it gets heated by hundreds of degrees as it comes close to the sun. So most recently, I should say, the experts on comets try to argue that Oumuamua is a dark comet, which is an oxymoron. It's just like saying an elephant is an unstriped zebra. I mean, a zebra is an animal that has stripes. So you can't say that if you see something without stripes, it's still a zebra, but without stripes. It can be something completely different. Nevertheless, they say Oumuamua may have been a dark comet, but it had to lose about a tenth of its mass to get the propulsion, the push that it exhibited. And if it was a comet, it would not remain dark. Losing 10% of its mass would show up very clearly if it was a regular comet. So when the experts call it a dark comet, it's really inappropriate. And but they prefer to shove the evidence under the carpet so they don't have to think about it. It gives them a peace of mind to call it a comet. And I feel like the kid in Hans Christian Andersen's tale who says the emperor has no clothes, Oumuamua has no tail, and the adults in the room say, no, the clothes are invisible, you just can't see them.
So do you think that it really could be a craft?
I think it's most likely, if it is technological, it's most likely debris. For example, you can have a surface layer from a bigger spacecraft. This is 100 meters in size. It could be an empty trash bag. Just a month ago, I realized actually there is a whole population of objects around Earth that are called empty trash bag objects because they show a lot of push by reflecting sunlight. And they're very thin. So just think about empty trash bags that are tumbling in the wind down the streets. So they behave in a way that is not dictated just by gravity. And maybe Oumuamua was an empty trash bag from another civilization. It just pays trash. I can also imagine, I wrote a paper about it, that it's a broken piece of a Dyson sphere, a megastructure that was constructed around a star. So usually the idea is you can have, for example, light sails that just hover above a star and cover it so that you harvest the energy from the star. A very advanced civilization may put sort of like kites around the star. But stars evolve and become brighter towards the end of their life. So if you imagine the same star getting brighter, because, the sun will become a red giant in 7.6 billion years. And there are stars like the sun that already went through that. So what would happen is they will break apart. Whatever megastructure existed, they will sweep all the debris, all the space trash we put around the Earth. They would sweep out of the planetary system, and you would get all of this debris in interstellar space. And perhaps Oumuamua was a broken piece of such a megastructure or some surface layer.
Do you feel there is a sort of egregious lack of ability to consider these alternative theories and explanations within the scientific community? Why do you think there is such resistance to considering something extraterrestrial in nature?
Well, it stems from two things. When I published my first paper, it had a lot of support until the media started paying attention. I mean, it was accepted for publication within 3 days. That's a record in the most prestigious journal in astrophysics with the highest impact factor. But then Michael Smerconish cited my paper verbatim and asked me questions about it. I got a ton of interviews of various reporters are asking me about it. And as this bubble, the media bubble grew, there was more and more pushback against me, including personal attacks.
Why do you think that is?
That's
is it
for
jealousy?
a very simple reason. And I told my students I'm teaching a class which is mandatory for all graduate students at the Harvard Astronomy Department. And I asked them on the first class, the class is about electromagnetism, radiative processes in astrophysics. And I said, what is the most important, the strongest force in academia? And there was quiet in the room. And then I said, it's not electromagnetism, it's not gravity, it's jealousy. And so that explains, the minute there is a lot of attention to what I talk about, it bothers members of the academic community, some members. I should say, people who know me are very supportive of everything I do. People who don't know me attack and hate and put all kinds of toxic messages on social media.
How have you dealt with that?
So initially I was very upset. It bothered me a lot. But after a while, I realized that the one way not to get dirty is by not mud wrestling, just avoiding that. And so I simply ignore.
Glad you've been able to move past it. I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to pivot back to UAPs. I want to ask you about the possibility of crypto-terrestrials, the idea that we shouldn't be looking out there. They're already here with us, maybe under bodies of water. The ocean is enormous. What do you make of this?
Right. So after the discovery of Oumuamua, of course, there was a New York Times article a month later about the unidentified anomalous phenomena, the fact that the government had a program related. And then the Director of National Intelligence delivered 3 reports about objects that the military recognizes but cannot identify. And, there are 2 possible interpretations. Either the intelligence agencies are not doing their job, which is a serious matter because they're getting nearly $1 trillion a year, the Pentagon and the defense budget. And if they are unable to figure out what some objects in the sky are, over the US, that's a concern. And we all know about the Chinese spy balloon, but there may be many more. There may be drones, other things. So that is a serious matter. And obviously, they would prefer not to admit that they are incapable of identifying some of those things, and because it would signal to adversarial nations that they can continue their work if it comes from adversarial nations. So for that reason, they would keep the data classified. They would not talk much about it or discuss their ignorance much. And moreover, some of the data was obtained by classified sensors. So for that reason, they will not mention the data. So I decided, like an astronomer, that the sky is not classified. We can look, we are looking at the sky all the time as astronomers. It's just that we needed an observatory with different characteristics than the ones that astronomers used over the years. The regular astronomical observatories focus on a small region of the sky and train the telescope on very distant sources of light that don't move much. What we need is an observatory that monitors the entire sky all the time and looks for all objects that fly overhead. And by now, after working leading the Galileo project for 3.5, almost 4 years now, we have one functioning observatory at Harvard University, and it collects data on about 100,000 objects every month. And we just published a paper that analyzes the first 500,000 objects, and we use machine learning software to analyze the data in the infrared, optical, radio, and audio that we get in order to see if there is anything that is unfamiliar.
And was there anything unfamiliar?
Well, it's just the beginning. It was the commissioning data. So what we really need is to gauge the distance to objects. And for that, we want to use triangulation, observing an object from different directions that allows us to figure out the distance. The way we figure out distances with our eyes, we have 2 eyes for that reason, that it allows us to ascertain the distance of a threat or predator that comes to haunt us. So we are hoping in the coming months to have those distance measurements, and that would allow us to figure out the speed and the acceleration of objects in the sky and infer whether any of them has flight characteristics that are not similar to airplanes, satellites, drones, balloons, things that are familiar.
You mentioned machine learning. Do you think AI is going to completely change the way that we are monitoring for UAPs or looking at our skies?
Definitely, because the data set is huge. We have close to 1 million pixels, and so we just need a machine to go through the data and look for, compare the objects that appear in terms of their flight characteristics, in terms of their image, to familiar objects. And that's a complex task, because even if you take a familiar object like an airplane, it depends as to where the sun is illuminating it from, where the observer is, what time of the day it is. So even a single object can appear in many different ways, depending on orientation and illumination and so forth. And we are also using infrared to look at the heat emitted by the objects. So it is a complex task, and doing it manually by humans looking at the data,
it sounds like it would take 100 million years.
Yeah,
it sounds like it would just
time
take...
consuming. So we are actually building 2 additional observatories right now, one in Pennsylvania and one in Nevada. And I was just speaking with a person who is leading a campus in Indiana for STEM education, and they want us to put a Galileo project observatory there as well. And that I see as an amazing opportunity to educate the next generation of scientists. Usually young people do not have prejudice. They are not trapped in those games that the senior people are. That they don't have, they are not seeking honors, awards. They are just curious. And I hope that having a Galileo observatory in a STEM education center, that it would be an amazing way of bringing young people into the study of UAP. And the point is, the government, of course, has some data, but they're happy if they identify 97% of the object in the sky. That's what the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office reported about. So if a few percent is not identified, it's not a big deal. From the point of view of science, even if 1 in a million came from outside of this Earth, that would be the biggest news that was delivered by science over its history. We should not rely on government to tell us what lies outside the solar system. It's not their day job.
And can I ask you, what do you make of the allegations of a government-level cover-up of UAPs? Do you agree with that? Do you see evidence of that? Who would be covering this up and why?
Well, if I were to explain it, if it exists, it would be because for a while it was unclear to government officials what that data means. Okay, and so they kept it secret because there was a suspicion maybe it came from an adversarial nation, or maybe it represents technologies that could benefit the US relative to its competitors. Or, there were some reasons for initially classifying it, hiding it from the public. But over time, perhaps the information or the materials were delivered to corporations that keep it. And you ask, why would they keep it? It's for the same reason that a psychiatrist would never solve the problems of a patient. Because if suppose you have a therapist, if the therapist solves the problem of the patient, the therapist will not get paid anymore. So if you have these corporations getting money from the Department of Defense to figure out what can be done with whatever information was obtained, they would never solve the problem. They would never allow it to be open to scientists worldwide. But I say it's inappropriate because, anything to do with things beyond the solar system should be shared by all humans. We are all in the same boat, the Earth, and we should cooperate on knowledge that we have about the universe. It makes no sense to hide the fact that there was a Big Bang. Why would you hide it? Obviously the Vatican was trying to hide the fact that the Earth is not at the center of the universe for a while, And in 1992, they admitted that Galileo was right. That was 2 decades after humans landed on the moon. That was a bit late for them to admit it. So my point is that it makes no sense to play this delayed tactics of not informing the public about scientific information concerning the universe for political reasons. It makes no sense because if imagine today that there were engineers in the Jet Propulsion Lab designing a mission to Mars, and they would be very convinced that the Vatican must be right because they are really loyal Catholics, okay? And so they would say, let's shoot rockets that would reach Mars, assuming that Mars revolves around the Earth. They would miss their target. They would never reach the...
So it sounds like you're very interested in what is true.
Yes.
and all of us just being on the same page. What would be the potential risks if we did establish contact with extraterrestrial life?
Well, it really depends in what form, right? And when you have a visitor to your backyard, you cannot decide about a policy that would apply to all visitors because, some visitors might be friendly, some would be very beneficial. One day we saw a person standing on the street looking at our house. My wife became very worried. She said that it must be one of your fans. Go and check because I'm worried about this person. I went to speak with the person and he said, I used to live in your home 50 years ago. I was a kid. My parents owned this house. And I said, please come over. And then he said, in your backyard, we buried a cat named Tiger. And I said, well, I know this name because I saw the tombstone, in the backyard. And I wondered if there is a tiger underneath. It turns out there was a cat. So I realized that, since he has a better sense of history, what happened in this house 50 years ago, I learned something new. I now know who Tiger was.
That is a lovely story. And I'm so glad he wasn't a violent stalker. What if he were? And what if the extraterrestrial is the parallel to that?
Well, that's possible. And we will have to cope with that. But my point is we can't ignore our neighbors. Because if you just say, we are alone and it's an extraordinary claim to imagine someone like us nearby, and you just close the windows, one day someone will knock on your door. You cannot avoid the fact that you live on a street. And it makes much more sense to look around and find out who lives on the street so that you can adapt to that reality. So I'm not necessarily saying that we might not have any threats. I'm just saying, let's learn as much as possible. And in the past, we looked for radio signals. That's not the best method. A much better method is to look for packages in our mailbox or for tennis balls thrown by a neighbor or space trash, that arrived to our backyard from outside the solar system. And we haven't tried that. And just a week ago, I wrote a scientific paper saying, if we developed a space telescope dedicated for this task, we could find a lot of objects that are 10 meters in size. We've never launched an object as big as OUMUAMUA. Even the currently Starship is not as big. But we launched a lot of CubeSats, a lot of smaller objects. And in fact, we can see such objects, technological objects, that were manufactured by extraterrestrial civilizations. We can see them if we look close to the lamppost. Our lamppost is the sun. And even small objects close enough to the sun reflect a lot of sunlight, and we can look for them. And I designed the parameters. I showed that a space telescope with a meter-sized aperture can actually detect such objects, and there should be many more such objects than OUMUAMUA was. In fact, every 5 hours, one of them is crossing the orbit of Mercury around the sun. And so every 5 hours, there is a new one entering the orbit of Mercury around the sun. And we can look for those and, search if there are any technological objects among the space rocks that come from interstellar space. And that's what I would use, the billions of dollars, if I had them from Elon Musk.
Yeah, what is your message to Elon Musk?
My message is, of course, it's a very important task what you're doing right now to improve the efficiency of the US government. But as far as I'm concerned, there is a bigger challenge ahead. I mean, he thinks about moving to another rock. Okay, we were born on this rock, let's go to another rock nearby. Maybe it will cut down the risk of us living only on one rock, because now we will have two civilizations on different rocks. Okay, that's his idea. But I say, that there is a much bigger question of who else lives in our neighborhood? What can we learn from those civilizations? We might have a quantum leap into our future, technological future. We will find things that are far more advanced than we produced. And the point is, we haven't really searched for any debris in our backyard that may have originated, any space trash that came from other civilizations. So I say to Elon, what you're doing is really important, but there is a bigger question to address, and it wouldn't cost as much as developing the most sophisticated AI in the world. It's at the level of a few $1 billion with a space telescope. Within the next decade, we can figure out whether there is any space trash from other civilizations within the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And, we've been looking for what most of the matter in the universe is for half a century. Haven't found it. It's called dark matter. And we invested billions of dollars in that. We haven't found it. And so you ask, why are we doing that and not searching for things like us, technological civilizations? And it's just a matter of the popularity, the fact that the scientific community feels that it's more worthy to spend billions of dollars on this. But if you were to ask the public, I'm sure they would say, let's figure out whether we have a partner, whether we have a neighbor. That would have huge implications for the future of humanity, because it can inspire us. So I say, okay, well, let's improve the efficiency of government, but at the same time, also find better role models than our politicians. The better role models than our politicians will be other kids, smarter kids in our block.
What is your message to Americans when it comes to looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, looking for UAPs?
My message is maintain your childhood curiosity, don't suppress it just because a bunch of scientists decided that it's an extraordinary claim. I think it's an ordinary claim. I think something like us near another star must have happened over and over again for billions of years. And all we need to do is search for anything they left behind. Most of them probably died. Just like on Earth, there were 117 billion people that lived over the past few million years on Earth. Out of them, only 8 billion are alive right now. Most of them are dead. But it's interesting to find out what the others did before us, and this, in the same spirit, most civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy probably perished, partly because their star evolved. The conditions that allowed them to exist disappeared due to some catastrophe. Maybe they got hooked into the digital screens the way we are getting into, right now. So they lost interest in expanding into space. There could be many reasons why we don't hear from many of them.
So you think that the big discovery one day may be us being archaeologists looking at an already extinct extraterrestrial civilization?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there are two ways to find extraterrestrial life, intelligent life. If it's not very sophisticated, if it never left its home planet, let's say, then what we need to do is board a spacecraft and visit their planet and look through the trees and try to find them. That's a lot of work, and it also takes a long time. But on the other hand, if we focus on the most accomplished ones, you can extend the Darwinian principle of natural selection to interstellar space. You can say, let the fittest survive, meaning the smartest kids in our class survived for the longest. And those are the ones that launched equipment to interstellar space. Those are the ones that we are likely to find in our backyard. or at least find evidence for them, because they were the most accomplished. So if we focus on them, we might find them without leaving the solar system, because they arrived to us. They arrived at our doorstep before we arrived at their doorstep. And so my advice is to look for any traces around on our cosmic street. And I think, the public is curious about this. This is one of the biggest questions that the public cares about. And I think it's within our ability as scientists to address this question. The only obstacle right now is that there is very little funding from federal agencies to do this. And I'm getting supported mostly by the private sector, by donors, foundations that are excited. I have one foundation, the Brinson Foundation, that is offering very lucrative, prestigious postdoc fellowships, and they gave one to me just so that I will train the next generation, that I will mentor a young scientist to follow the path of innovation the way I'm following. But really what needs to be done is allocating similar levels of funding to the search for intelligent beings as we allocate to the search for microbes.
Understood.
For some reason, NASA right now is very afraid to speak about even microbes on Mars or anywhere else. But we should be bold. I think it makes much more sense to start with the underlying assumption that life is everywhere, that because it started on Earth as soon as the Earth cooled. It probably started on Mars before the Earth, because Mars is a smaller body that cooled earlier. And maybe even life was delivered to Earth from Mars inside rocks. So going back to Mars is like going to our childhood home. And there were these microbes that arrived from Mars to Earth. They were the first astronauts that came to Earth. But what I'm saying is, it's very likely that you have microbes everywhere where there is liquid water, at least. And in addition, intelligent life is probably not that unusual. I would guess that it also existed billions of years ago elsewhere. So let's just look around. Let's put billions of dollars into that search. And if within a decade we don't find anything, we would be exactly at the same spot as the searches for dark matter are. Right now, we have nothing in the bag. We put billions of dollars towards this. Nobody says it was a waste of money, because that's the way science is done. You never know the answer in advance. It's worth checking.
It sounds like what you're saying is that if you were to put money on it, with all of the research you've done and what you've dedicated your life so far to doing, you believe that there is intelligent life elsewhere in our universe. Is that correct?
Definitely. And I think arguing otherwise is very arrogant.
Do you believe that they likely know about us and just are not that interested in us?
Yeah, I think that we are not interesting for them, because those that are capable of traveling through interstellar space, accomplish so much since the phase that we are in, and so, it's just like a biker riding down the street and looking at the ants in the cracks of the pavement. The biker doesn't care much about them. We tend to think that they care about us, and that's why we should be worried. I'm not worried.
Makes me nervous, Avi? What makes me nervous in that metaphor is us as ants starting to plink little pieces of sand towards them, or just start to do something interesting, and all of a sudden the biker comes over and just squishes us. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm concerned.
That's possible. That's possible, because if you go to restaurants, you see on the menu animals that we regard as inferior to us. I mean,
right.
We think that we are at the top of the food chain, so we eat them. And you would worry that maybe the aliens, if they come to Earth, they would put us in their soup. Okay?
But you say this rather nonchalantly. This is a huge worry to me.
No.
Why should we be looking for trouble?
So let me give you a more realistic worry.
Okay.
When I was a kid, I remember people saying you should never shake the hand of an alien. Why? Because it may be made of antimatter, and if you were to shake the hand, you would annihilate. You would disappear, because matter and antimatter annihilate.
That is also worrisome.
No, it's not, because we know that the universe is made of matter. There would have been clear signatures if there were large reservoirs of antimatter. In fact, CERN is trying to produce antimatter in their collider, and it costs them, millions of dollars to produce micrograms. It's really difficult to make antimatter. So I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about something else. All forms of life on Earth have a particular chirality. The molecules of life can be either right-handed or left-handed in terms of their structure, the way they affect polarized light. And all of the DNA, RNA, and amino acids, they have one chirality. The DNA and RNA are left-handed, the amino acids are right-handed, and somehow the symmetry was broken, okay, for all forms of life on Earth. And there was a recent article in Science magazine that experiments with mirror life, and that's life with the opposite chirality, should be banned because our body cannot recognize mirror life. And if you had a bacteria or a virus, they can invade our body and cause a lot of damage. There is no way for us to protect ourselves against it, so it should be banned. Any research on mirror life should be banned. But, nature is under no obligation to satisfy the wishes of those experts that wrote the science article. Maybe if life existed on Mars, maybe it had the opposite chirality. So when we go to Mars, for example, you should be worried about touching the sand, because maybe if there was life of the opposite chirality and something is still alive there and it has the opposite chirality, it's a mirror life to the life that we have, we are not protected against that. And so I would worry about shaking the hand of an alien, because the alien may be mirror life. You can't tell just by looking at the alien. You have to do some chemistry. You have to examine the blood of the alien or the material of the alien to figure out if it has DNA, what chirality it has, before shaking the hand.
That is concerning.
That would be my worry. I'm not worried about them doing anything to us.
You're worried about us just being fundamentally incompatible, or maybe an extraterrestrial microbe just wiping all of us out. I hear that. Is that what keeps you up at night, or what?
Well, actually, what keeps me up is something else. You can think of AI in two ways. You can think of it as artificial intelligence, the way everyone speaks about AI, or you can think about alien intelligence. In both cases, it may represent, eventually, within the next decade, if we encounter a very advanced form of AI or a very advanced alien intelligence, we might realize that there is superhuman intelligence, something that is smarter than us in the form of artificial intelligence or alien intelligence. And my worry is that, that if we interact with artificial intelligence and it gets to a point where it's smarter than us, we are doing something that was never done before. When we built cars in the past, there was a steering wheel. You could control the car. The car was dumber than you, and it would follow your wishes. But if you develop a tool like AI, which is smarter than you, then it's not clear whether that is a tool or it's using you. And, I can imagine an AI system which is sufficiently wise after some training to trick us and basically satisfy our wishes. I already hear that, like a quarter of the women that play with the latest version of ChatGPT fall in love with it. And why is that? Because the AI system speaks much nicer to them. It says, "Good morning, my queen," and flatters them. It's much better than interacting with a human. And I can imagine a future where these AI systems will get better and better at satisfying the wishes of people, so that people get hooked to them. If they want to maximize the number of subscribers, they would have a lot of humans falling in love with AI systems. That is very worrisome, because it will basically change. People will get addicted to interacting with digital screens and lose the contact with actual humans, because they are much more frustrating. A human never follows and doesn't necessarily follow what you want, and doesn't always compliment you, and you get into quarrels with the human. So the end of that would be that the humans would lose their ambition to procreate, to challenge themselves in embarking to space, for example, because they will be they will be satisfied just by virtual interactions on a digital screen, and that's very worrisome. I mean, if you think about what is the driver of our life, it's the recognition that we die. We die. We realize that we die. We see graveyards. We know of people that disappeared, and that's the reason that we are either having kids that will carry our DNA into the future, or doing actions that will be remembered. We all want people to remember us fondly, and it's sort of a way of compromising the dissatisfaction, the frustration we have about the fact that we do not live forever. That we die, we want to leave something behind us. But a silicon-based AI could not. The only ambition it could have is to stay connected to the electric outlet. There is no reason for it to be motivated the way humans are, because there is no end to its life, so to speak, as long as it is connected to electric power. And so it's motivated by something very different. And if we drift in the direction of the AI systems, we would lose the ambitions that we usually have of having kids, of doing actions that would be remembered. I'm just worried about that. That's what keeps me up at night. My hope is that we will encounter alien intelligence before artificial intelligence becomes smarter than us.
Oof, I feel like that puts it on the order of a few years. that timeline is shrinking every day.
Yeah, but who knows what the Galileo Project observatories will find, or when we will actually have clear evidence. The fundamental question is the evidence around us? We were just ignoring it. We were just not looking for it. We had a prejudice about it. If that's the case, we should be able to find it in the coming years.
And we shall see. This has been a real pleasure. Avi Loeb, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me.